Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Robbins, and welcome to Life, Death, and the Space Between podcast. I really struggled with what to do with the episode for today. It didn't feel quite right for me to go on business as usual, given everything that's going on in the United States today with the protests over the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm going to share with you an episode with Rabbi Wendi Geffen that we put out a couple months ago, and I just want everybody to listen again with a different ear, maybe this time around, and to just consider in your own mind the thoughts that you have, the unconscious and implicit biases that we all walk around with every single day, no matter who we are, no matter how we were raised. It is part of the fabric of being human, and I think that this episode once again allows us to look at our own vulnerabilities, just as Rabbi Geffen does so honestly and openly in her discussion with me in this podcast about what goes on in each of our minds, and how if we just stop for a minute and listen to what our mind is telling us, that maybe we don't need to react so quickly, and maybe we can make a different choice, and maybe, just maybe, that choice can really change the direction of another person's life. So here you are again with Rabbi Geffen's story. Can you kind of speak to your experience, speak a little bit about faith? Because I know you talk about faith. You talked about faith in this sermon and how you understood it and how that may have shifted a little bit for you throughout this.
So do you want to hear the story?
Well, let's maybe start with faith,
okay,
and then
in general, So, it's interesting, this idea of faith. And in Judaism, faith can mean a lot of different things, right? In any context, I'll just speak to the Jewish one. Faith could mean, belief, right? And sort of, I guess it implies maybe like a belief in God or something beyond us. Faith could also mean like something more reminiscent of hope, right? Like the idea that I have faith that everything will turn out all right, no matter what it is.
Like trust.
Like trust. I often talk about, there's a definition of hope, which I think, which resonates for me personally deeply. And it's the previous prime minister of the Czech Republic. His name was Václav Havel. He said something along the lines of, hope isn't the understanding that everything will turn out the way we want it to be. Hope is the understanding that however it is that it turns out, it's worth our efforts and our best efforts to make it so, regardless of what happens in the end. And that idea of hope or faith, to me, is really resonant.
I always say, like, it's the belief that I will be okay.
Yeah.
That I will be able to handle or deal with whatever comes my way.
Yeah, and I love that. And I would sort of say, like, that idea that everything will be okay. Even if we aren't okay, it will be okay. I don't think it's the idea that everything has like a silver lining or everything will be beautiful in the end.
Right.
Right? Sometimes things don't fall out that way. Life takes its courses in different ways. But we'll be able to navigate whatever it is. My daughter and I watched the new Frozen movie last night. And I think actually it did a beautiful, beautiful job about capturing a person in a very dark moment. And the song is, I'll do the next best thing, which is just the idea that even if you can't see any light, you can still do the next best thing. Whatever the next thing is, whatever the next best thing is to be done, that's what we can do. And, the idea being, hopefully it leads us on a path where we do start to see light, or things do work out for the good,
right,
or more for the good than the bad.
Right.
But we always have, if we're living, if we're breathing, we have the ability to choose to take a step forward. And I think that's faith, right? Like the idea that like I can take a step forward regardless of what's happening. And there's some kind of built-in trust whether that's in God, in the universe, in the self, there has to be some kind of embedded trust in that in order to make that motivation there.
Right. So what was your experience?
So my experience was crazy. So, and it's still like, it's now been a number of months, and I think about this all the time. So, it was the day after Yom Kippur, so Yom Kippur in the Jewish world is probably the most intense spiritual day for any Jewish person, but for clergy people, it's super intense. And it marks kind of like the closing of a really intense, almost 2-week period of time that began with a Jewish New Year called Rosh Hashanah, and then there's a lot of stuff that happens in between, and it all culminates on Yom Kippur. So the day after Yom Kippur is like a very happy, good, kind of self-focused day for clergy people. I had made an appointment for a massage that day. I like, you can often find like random rabbis or cantors like at the movies, or just doing nothing of any spiritual significance, really. Not that there's anything wrong with a movie.
But taking care of yourself has a lot of spiritual significance.
Self-care, right? But so it wouldn't be a day we would consider like a particularly mindful day for us. And so I was on my way driving to my massage, and I was going down a road in one direction, and another car was coming in the other direction and pulled into the left turn lane to turn left, what would be across my lane, to get into the shopping center that was to my right. And anyway, just as I approached that intersection, I had a green light, but they like suddenly sort of gunned this turn and shot out in front of me. And there was no way that the cars weren't going to collide. And you know, there are these moments where like, something traumatic is about to happen. And although like time doesn't stop or slow down, you can, for some reason, my experience in these moments is that it does, like all of a sudden it expands, and there's time to think about a lot of different things.
Right.
So I had all these thoughts in my head about, oh my God, we're going to crash. I hope nobody's hurt. I don't even know who's in her car, where our cars hit, what's going to happen. It was very frightening.
And also sort of, I would imagine, like the selfish human part of you that's like, oh, and this was my day for me.
Exactly.
And
at the end, exactly. And it literally at the end of that like thought process, right before the impact happened, I was like, man, I'm going to like not get to this massage. And I was like very put out and angry about it. And that was like the last feeling that I had in my head before this impact. Wasn't like one of like the most glorious moments.
But we're all human.
Yes, we're all human, so they say. So and it ended up being a pretty significant impact and accident. Our cars were really like beat up, pretty damaged. But we were able to kind of like drive them to the side of the road. And then the other driver got out of the car that she was in, and I was able to get out of mine. So it was clear that neither of us was hurt in a way that we would need to go to a hospital or something like that. So I got out of the car, she got out of hers, and I asked her, I was like, are you okay? And she responded to me kind of like put out, and in an angry kind of voice, where she said something like, well, I guess I will be okay. And she said it like fast and irritated. And she had like her eyes looked strange. They were like wide, and it was something I noticed. I guess I assumed at the time she was angry or what, irritated, put out. But then she never like asked me how I was. And so I was certainly like irritated at this point. So I was like, well, I'm fine too. And started to walk back into my car. And as I was, walked back toward the door, I turned to her and I was like, we're going to have to call the police. It had been a big accident. And she was like, I know. And she just same tone, and kind of, she got back in her car, and I got back in mine, and I called 911 and took some time to get the police there. So it gave like a pretty extended period of time just to kind of think about what happened, what's going to happen. And I was sitting there just, kind of brooding about how annoyed and irritated I was and what nerve this person had to be irritated. It was her. She caused this accident, not me. I had the right of way. And had sort of been, and I'm just, telling myself all these narratives that are just all about how like righteous I am and how awful this other person is.
And I think an important part of this story is she's an African-American woman.
Exactly.
In a predominantly white suburb of Chicago.
Yeah, and not just that. Her car was like an old beat up car already. So the community where this happened in is a community where by and large everything looks kind of perfect. Grasses and lawns are manicured and landscaped. People drive fancy cars. You don't typically see like a old beat up car, and it is not the most diverse community in any way, shape, or form, and certainly not racially diverse. And so that really is where, I'm thinking this to myself all about how put out I am. And then I start also thinking to myself right around the same time, because it's the day after Yom Kippur, and like the Jewish high holidays are all about like being forgiving, not being judgmental, not judging other people, because who are we to judge? God is the judge, not us. That kind of idea. And like I literally preach this all the time.
Right.
And then I started thinking to myself like, wow, like this idea of being like aware of ourselves and our own self-righteousness. It's so much easier to put that in check during the high holidays than it is after them.
Right.
And it hadn't even been 24 hours.
And that period, I was listening to your sermon again with my daughter last night. And when you said it in the sermon, she laughed. And I wasn't sure if she knew what that meant. And I turned to her, she was just bat mitzvahed. And I said, do you understand what she means? And she goes, yeah. She's like, the year from Yom Kippur to Rosh Hashanah is a lot longer than the short period of time from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur.
Exactly. And it was really like, I'd like to think that I always am preaching to everyone, including myself. I don't think that I'm better than anybody else or above any message that anyone might have to offer, including a message that I might have to offer. So like the benefit of that is that like it's readily in my mind, this stuff. And then I realized, I was like, oh my God, I'm being so self-righteous. Like maybe something else is happening here in this moment. And then I started to think about what was actually happening, which was, okay, so here is this woman who I don't know why she's here, but she doesn't fit here. And her eyes were so wide and strange. What I assumed had been irritation, maybe it was fear, right? And her quick-paced voice, her kind of bugged out eyes, her kind of frazzled nature. Maybe that wasn't that she was put out. Maybe she was frightened at what had happened or what maybe she thought was going to happen now.
What we were talking about before I started recording, and I would encourage you all who are listening to think about, is to stop for a minute and think about your assumptions in this situation, because we all have them. Right. And I know that this show isn't necessarily about that, but it is about how we can live more meaningful lives. And I think part of how we get caught in not living meaningful lives is making assumptions about people when we don't know what their stories are.
Well, and then I would also say, like, one of the luxuries of what ended up happening was I had this time to reflect. And I feel like when we're dealing with implicit bias or whatever it is, the assumptions we make about anything, often we have to create time to process, okay, let me think to myself, what are my assumptions in this case, but what is actually going on? Do they align? Do they not? It was probably 20 minutes before the police arrived. So it was a lot of time to kind of think about it. And I'm so grateful for that. So then maybe 10 minutes into this period of time, this woman gets out of her car, comes over to my car and is like, can you help me find my hazard lights? I don't know where they are. And the whole kind of encounter, I don't want to say it was sweet, but her way of being, her demeanor, kind of her approach, it changed. So I went to her car and I was glad we were able to have some kind of like helping experience. And so, but she didn't know where her hazard lights were, which was another kind of, now that I reflect back on it, kind of clue in this encounter. The police come The officer comes to my car, gets my driver's license, my insurance, all that stuff, goes to the other car, then goes back to her car, the police car, to, I assume, put in the information. She then comes back to my car and says, here's your license, here's your insurance, what have you. I want to let you know that the other driver does not have a license or insurance, and that you need to leave now. You should go. To me. And so I said to her, I think she might be scared, the other driver. And the officer was like, I bet she is, and you should probably go. Which I assumed meant she was going to have to arrest her. And so at that point in time, now, because I have a different story in my head, I become very worried about what's going to happen to this woman. The sort of two scenarios in my head were, the least bad one was she's going to get arrested and then she's going to have a record. And I know about what criminal records do in the community, in particular in an African-American community. It doesn't look like this person has resources to get herself out of jail or get an attorney. I don't know, but that's a really bad story that unfolds, and that's the least bad one. And then the other story is, I don't know where she's from. Maybe she's not from our country. And then I was like, oh my God, she's going to get deported. And that was terrifying, right? But the police officer told me to go, and I didn't know what to do. And then, so I left. I drove whatever. My car was like, we were a half a mile from the body shop. So I sort of tootled along on the road and just was kind of processing all this stuff, and got to the body shop and just kind of burst into tears when I got in there, because I was like, oh my God, this person's life is now ruined. And I don't know what I can do about any of it, because it's now in this police officer's hand. My husband came to pick me up, and he was trying to be helpful about, there's nothing you can do about this, or suggesting things that we could do, and none of them were really realistic. And then I was just very upset and worried, and kind of at that point, you talk about like faith and hope. I did not really have any, and I was pretty despondent. I went home and talked to my kids about what had happened, and we all just were very upset and trying to think about what we could do the next day, because at this point it's now night, to go find this woman in the jail in the community. What were we going to do? Right.
So what started as this experience of just anger and frustration turns into like, how can I help this person?
Yeah, but also it got so much worse. Than just like it became a real feeling of like despondency of
for you.
Yeah, for me, that was my experience in it. And that's sort of how that evening ended. And then the next morning, my cell phone rang like really early, with a number I didn't recognize. And so when I answered it, it was the officer from the day before, her name is Officer Maldonado. And she was like, hi, it's Officer Maldonado. I just wanted to call you to let you know how everything unfolded yesterday after you left, because it seemed like you were upset. And I was like, oh my God, thank you so much for calling me. Is the woman okay? Right? Like, where is she? Is she okay? And the officer was like, yes, she's totally fine. That's why I'm calling you. And she told me the woman's name is Eleanor. And then she was like, I want to tell you a story about what happened. She kind of like paused in her talking to tell me that. And so I was like, okay, tell me what happened. And so she said, after I had left, she went back to her car, to the police car, to like try to find some contact information for this the driver, because the driver didn't know anything, as it turned out. She didn't know really her name. She didn't know anything about herself. And the police officer looks up I assume it was the license plate of the car. Somehow that gets her to a contact number. So she calls a number, and the person who answers the phone turns out to be the daughter of Eleanor. And they relay to the police officer that Eleanor has been missing for an extended period of time. They're from the south side of Chicago. They didn't know what had happened to her because she has dementia. So she had like taken the car and disappeared. She doesn't have a cell phone. She didn't take any of her stuff. They just had no clue what had happened to her. They had been like saving up money to get billboards like on the highway for a missing person. because they just didn't know. They had reported it, I guess, to the police, but like there was no reason for her to be on the North Shore.
Right.
Like there's no connection. I think they assumed she would have been in whatever local communities to her, and we're nowhere near that. So it just there was no information about it, basically. Right. So Officer Maldonado was like, why don't you come up and, come get your mom? I'll stay with her. And so the officer sat with Eleanor in her car for like the 2.5 hours that it took for them to get up, because it was like the early evening. So they had to drive through rush hour traffic. And the south side of Chicago is just nowhere near the North Shore.
Right.
So the family came up, they got her, and as it turned out, this is something that wasn't in the sermon, she did have a license and she did have insurance. She just didn't know she did. Oh. And they brought her home and she was safe and most importantly alive.
Right.
Right.
Which they thought they had lost her.
I mean, they had no clue what had happened to her. They assumed she must be gone. Like they just didn't know, and they feared she was dead. So then the police officer says to me, I don't know what you believe about these things. And I was like, well, she didn't know who I was, like what I did for a living or anything. And I was like, well, I'm a clergy person, I'm a rabbi. So like, I could probably go with you along this line of thinking or whatever. And she was like, okay, good. She said, well,
as opposed to just believing you got in an accident with someone.
Exactly. She was trying to bring some wisdom, which I thought was amazing. And then she was like, I think this happened for a reason. I think you were in the car for a reason. It was you for a reason. And everything that unfolded happened because it was put there to be that way, basically. And then she said, and if this hadn't happened this way, think about what could have happened to Eleanor, right? What would have then happened? This experience changed the trajectory of that story, which could have gone in any number of other ways, right?
And think of how many people the ripple effect.
Oh my God,
for
yeah.
That is.
I mean, it was just very powerful. And I would say I think all the more so that Officer Maldonado was the one who came and, made the decision not to instinctually react, but to seek out a contact number, try to figure out what else was going on. She really, in my mind, she was really the one who kind of changed the story because of her thoughts, her actions, what she did, which I don't know. Maybe that's always what she would have done. Right. But she did it nevertheless.
And she obviously thought there was something in you that gave her pause to think about, maybe I need to maybe rethink this.
Yeah. These are the things that, all of these things happen in these sequences and they allow different narratives to unfold. So I think probably everything that happened led to that for her, right?
So for those people that would say, oh, this was just a coincidence.
Right, yeah. I mean, look, I don't know, I don't know that anyone can ever say for sure, oh, well, I was put there, right? I don't know. I mean, I think we could choose to believe that we were put there or not. Either way, whether it just happened or whether we were put in a position to be messengers, the truth of the matter is we're always in the position to be messengers. If anything, that's, I guess, my what I was reminded about is that we always have the opportunity to see something more expansively, to get out of our instinct, to be less judgmental, to see a larger story, and to see ourselves in anybody else's story. Yes, and right, because that's what opens the door to empathy, right? Instead of judgment, which is really the place that I think most people live in most of the time, kind of our default subconscious, is a place of protection of ourselves, defensiveness. I guess that has its function in some way, shape, or form, but our higher callings, they're available to us all the time. And if we think of ourselves, I would say to the cynic, I would say, okay, so fine, don't think you were put there. Think of yourself as always there, Fine, there is no God. Mm-hmm. Nobody's going to put you anywhere. So nobody's here to help anything but you, right? All the more so would I say,
right.
Put yourself there then. Make yourself a messenger, right? Like, and what kind of framing would that provide for us as humans in the world? It doesn't, whether you have a religious faith or no faith at all, I think all of us kind of are bonded together with a yearning for good, not bad, right? Like for the betterment of our communities, not so people suffer, but so that they do better. I like to think that way. And if we think of ourselves that way, then it really can be that we are aware in this heightened state of the larger story, of which we're totally a part of all the time.
Right.
It works the other way too. Like so much of the time we abnegate ourselves of our agency in any given story. Well, who am I to, do X, Y, Z? I'm nobody. I don't count for anything. So I'll just let whatever is unfolding around me unfold, but it has nothing to do with me. I don't allow myself to emotionally connect to it. And I think that's really a symptom of the same lack of quote unquote faith. There's something really powerful about what would happen if we see ourselves that way all the time, if we see ourselves always as potentially in a position to change the story for the better.
And always in the position of maybe everything does happen for a reason, right?
Exactly,
like it shifts how you view that statement.
Exactly. And I think that gives me faith in the possibility that everything really can be for the good, or more for the good than for the bad. I don't know that anything works in total absolutes. But in this case, it really just for me brought to bear that tension between like everything can change in an instant, and there's not like, there's a lot that we can't control in our lives, but at the same time, everything can change in an instant, and that should remind us that we have some capability, some destiny, depending on how you understand it, in any moment to be a messenger. I'd like to think for the good.
Did you, stepping out of like the rabbi role in that moment, or as the story unfolded, feel like maybe you were?
For sure.
It did feel like something bigger.
As soon as I felt like the police officer was like my rabbi in that moment, like she was dropping like this faith message onto me. And I, for me, I really feel like she was the messenger. Like I would relay the same story that she told me, just to her in the frame, right? Like I would say, I think you were the police officer for the reason. I think you made the phone call for a reason. Like all of those things unfolded for the reason. I felt like I was just a kind of one part of this larger story, but it definitely felt as though things had unfolded the way they did and something larger was at play, right? And that doesn't happen to me every day at all. So,
and you're in the business.
Yes, exactly. And that is my business. I mean, I witness and I'm a part of a lot of amazing things all the time. But not so dramatically and personally. I'm often witness to it, not participant in it.
Right.
So it was very impactful. And something that I'm still thinking about and that my family is still talking about. And then I know other people who've seen this story in this sermon have remarked in the same regard. And it just, I think some things we won't ever know for sure, but I'd like to think there's the possibility, that I was there for that reason that day, that Officer Maldonado was there for that reason that day.
Right.
And that day it worked out that a person's, life was saved, in one way or another.
Well, it's such a beautiful story, and I'm grateful that you shared it with me today.
Thank you for asking me to share it.
And I will link to, because I'm sure maybe people will want to reach out, so I will link in my show notes, but can you tell people, if you want them to find you, where they can find you?
Sure. So you can just go to our synagogue website, which is www.nsci.org, like North Shore Congregation Israel. And anyone can get to me through the website.
Well, thank you so much for your time, for both episodes, which were phenomenal, for your wisdom always, for always getting me, and I'm sure this entire congregation, to think about things differently and to shift the way that they are in this world. So thank you.
Right back at you. Thank you.
Like what you heard today and want to hear more? Wondering what comes next and what it all means? Head over to Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or anywhere you get your podcasts and hit subscribe. Also, if you could take a minute to rate and review my podcast, I would really appreciate it. Stay tuned as we continue to explore life, death, and the space between.